The gunshot that echoed through Breckenridge, Colorado, that humid August morning in 1883, wasn't aimed at her. But it changed everything anyway when the startled horses bolted and overturned her father's wagon, leaving Sarah Owens orphaned at 22 with nothing but a trunk of books and a fierce determination to survive. 3 months later, she found herself sitting beneath the sprawling oak tree on the edge of town, the only spot of shade for miles around, her worn copy of Shakespeare open in her lap. The tree stood alone on a small hill overlooking the dusty Main Street, its branches twisted and ancient, somehow surviving the harsh Colorado climate. Sarah had claimed it as her sanctuary after spending her mornings working at the general store, the only job she could find after her father's death. The owner, Mrs. Kimball, was kind enough but paid little, and Sarah stretched every penny to afford the tiny room she rented above the saloon. The book in her hands was one of the few things her mother had left behind before consumption took her 5 years prior. Sarah traced the faded inscription on the inside cover, her mother's looping handwriting barely legible now. Reading had always been her escape, her way of traveling beyond the dusty confines of this mining town where men outnumbered women 10-1, and culture meant a piano player in the saloon who knew 3 songs. She was deep into Hamlet's soliloquy when a shadow fell across the page. "That looks mighty complicated for a hot afternoon," a voice said, warm and tinged with curiosity rather than mockery. Sarah looked up to find a tall man standing a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, sun-weathered skin, and eyes that were remarkably kind. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, dusty from the trail, with worn leather chaps and spurs that caught the afternoon light. "It's Shakespeare," Sarah said, surprised by her own willingness to engage. Most cowboys in Breckenridge either ignored her completely or made crude suggestions she pretended not to hear. "May I?" He gestured to the ground near the tree, still maintaining a polite distance. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Something about his demeanor put her at ease. He moved with a careful grace, settling himself against the trunk several feet away, far enough to be proper but close enough for conversation. "I'm Thomas Oakes," he said. "Most folks call me Thomas. I just signed on at the Double Bar Ranch about 10 miles north. Sarah Owens." She closed her book, marking her place with a dried wildflower. "You're new to Breckenridge, arrived 2 days ago. Been working ranches in Wyoming, but heard they needed hands here." He pulled a canteen from his belt and took a long drink. "Haven't seen many people reading under trees. It's a nice sight." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "I come here when I can. It's quiet." "What's the book about?" Thomas asked, genuine interest in his voice. "A prince who must avenge his father's murder," Sarah said. "But he thinks too much, questions too much. By the time he acts, everyone dies." Thomas was quiet for a moment, digesting this. Sounds like he needed to trust his gut more. Perhaps. Sarah smiled slightly. "But then it wouldn't be a tragedy. You like sad stories." "I like stories that feel true," Sarah corrected. "Happy or sad doesn't matter as much as whether they show something real about people." They talked until the shadows grew long and Sarah realized she'd be late for her shift serving dinner at the boarding house, a second job she'd taken to supplement her meager income. She gathered her book hastily, apologizing. "Will you be here tomorrow?" Thomas asked, standing as she did. "I usually come after my morning shift at the general store," Sarah said, then wondered why she was telling him this. "Would you mind if I joined you again?" His expression was hopeful but not presumptuous. "It's nice to talk to someone about something other than cattle and horses." Sarah found herself nodding. "I wouldn't mind." That night, Lying in her narrow bed above the saloon with its tinny piano and raucous laughter filtering through the floorboards, Sarah thought about Thomas Oakes. She'd taught herself to be wary of men, especially after her father's death, when several had made it clear they thought an orphaned woman needed taking care of in ways that made her skin crawl. But Thomas had been different, respectful, genuinely interested in her thoughts. She told herself not to be foolish. He was a drifting cowboy and she was a shop girl with no prospects. Nothing would come of it. But the next afternoon, when her shift at the store ended, she found her feet carrying her quickly toward the oak tree, her heart beating faster than it should. Thomas was already there, sitting with his back against the trunk, his hat pulled low against the sun. He straightened when he saw her approaching, a genuine smile crossing his face. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted. "I told you I would," Sarah said, settling into her usual spot. She pulled out a different book today, a collection of poetry. "That's different from yesterday," Thomas observed. "I finished Hamlet last night. I couldn't sleep." She didn't mention the saloon noise or the cramped room or the loneliness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm her. "Will you read some aloud?" Thomas asked. "I'd like to hear how the words sound." Sarah hesitated. It felt intimate somehow, reading poetry to this near stranger, but something in his open expression made her want to try. She opened to a poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning and began to read, her voice soft at first, then growing stronger. The words spoke of love and longing, of souls meeting across distances. When she finished, Thomas was quiet, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon. "That was beautiful," he said finally. "The way you read it, I mean, you made me feel what she was feeling." "That's the gift of good poetry," Sarah said. "It captures what we all feel but can't always express." They fell into an easy conversation, and Sarah found herself telling Thomas about her father's death, about the struggle to survive on her own, about how books were her only luxury. Thomas listened without interrupting, without offering the empty platitudes most people gave. "My mother taught me to read," Thomas said when she finished. "We didn't have many books, but she made sure I knew my letters. She said a man who could read could never truly be poor because he'd always have worlds to explore." "She sounds wise," Sarah said. "She died when I was 15. Cholera outbreak in Kansas." Thomas pulled up a blade of grass, twisting it between his fingers. "My father followed her 6 months later, just gave up, I think, couldn't bear the world without her." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, and meant it. "It was a long time ago. I've been working ranches ever since, moving from place to place." He looked at her directly. "Never had much reason to stay anywhere, until maybe now." The weight of those last words hung in the air between them. Sarah's breath caught in her chest, but before she could respond, a commotion from town drew their attention. Raised voices, the sound of breaking glass. Thomas stood quickly, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun at his hip. "Stay here," he said, but Sarah was already on her feet. "That's coming from near the store. Mrs. Kimball might need help." They hurried down the hill together, Sarah's skirts kicking up dust. A crowd had gathered outside the general store where 2 miners were fighting, their faces red with rage and alcohol despite the early hour. Mrs. Kimball stood in the doorway, her face pale. "They're fighting over a poker game from last night," someone in the crowd explained. "Johnson says Peters cheated." As they watched, one of the men pulled a knife. The crowd gasped and backed away. Before Sarah could even process what was happening, Thomas had moved forward, his voice carrying clear authority. "That's enough," he said, not loudly but with such command that both men paused. "You want to settle this, you do it proper. Fists only, outside town limits where you won't scare decent folks." The man with the knife, Johnson, turned his bleary eyes on Thomas. "This ain't your business, Cowboy. It is when you're frightening ladies and breaking the peace," Thomas said calmly. "You can put the knife away and walk off, or you can deal with me first. Your choice." Something in Thomas's stance, the easy confidence of a man who'd faced down worse than drunk minors, made Johnson reconsider. He spat in the dust, sheathed his knife, and staggered away. Peters followed after a moment, muttering curses. The crowd dispersed, disappointed at the lack of bloodshed. Mrs. Kimball approached Thomas, her hand over her heart. "Thank you, young man. I thought someone would surely die today." "Just in the right place at the right time, madam," Thomas said, his easy demeanor returning. Sarah saw him differently in that moment. Not just as the thoughtful man who wanted to discuss poetry, but as someone capable, strong, protective without being overbearing. The combination stirred something in her chest she'd been trying to ignore. They walked back toward the oak tree together, the afternoon's peace broken, but somehow the connection between them stronger. "You handled that well," Sarah said. "I've seen enough meaningless fights to know how to stop them," Thomas replied. "Life's too short to die over cards and whiskey." They reached the tree but didn't sit. Instead, they stood facing each other, and Sarah felt the shift in the air between them, the acknowledgement of something growing that neither had quite named yet. "Sarah," Thomas said, his voice gentler now, "I know I've only known you 2 days. I know I'm just a cowboy with nothing much to offer. But I'd like to keep coming here, to hear you read, to talk with you. If you're willing." Sarah looked at him, at his honest eyes and work-worn hands, at the way he stood with his hat held almost nervously between his fingers. She thought of all the books she'd read, all the love stories that seemed impossibly romantic and far removed from real life. Yet here was something real standing in front of her, uncertain and hopeful. "I'm willing," she said quietly. Thomas's smile was like sunrise. The next 2 weeks fell into a pattern that became the highlight of Sarah's difficult days. She would work her morning shift at the general store, endure Mrs. Kimball's increasingly pointed questions about that handsome cowboy, then meet Thomas under the oak tree. Sometimes she read to him, sometimes they simply talked, and sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, shoulders almost but not quite touching. Thomas told her about life on the range, about sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, about the satisfaction of honest work and the loyalty of a good horse. Sarah told him about the books she'd read, about her dreams of someday traveling east to see real theaters and libraries, about the mother she barely remembered but missed desperately. "What was your father like?" Thomas asked one afternoon as clouds built in the west promising rain. Sarah's expression clouded. "He was a good man, mostly. He loved my mother more than anything. After she died, he just went through the motions of living. He tried to take care of me, but his heart wasn't in it. When the wagon overturned when he died, part of me wondered if he'd simply decided to let go to follow her wherever she'd gone." "Like my father," Thomas said quietly. "Yes." Sarah looked at him. "Do you think that's love, being so bound to another person that you can't survive without them?" "I used to think it was weakness," Thomas admitted. "But lately I've been wondering if it's something else. Maybe it's knowing you've found the person who makes you complete, and the world without them just isn't worth navigating anymore. Have you ever felt that way about anyone?" Sarah asked, her heart racing as she voiced the question. Thomas turned to face her fully. "I'm starting to," he said simply. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and warm. Sarah should have gathered her books and run for cover, but she couldn't move, couldn't look away from Thomas's eyes. "Sarah," he said, and the way he said her name made it sound like poetry. "I know this is fast. I know we barely know each other. But I have to tell you that coming here, talking with you, listening to you read, It's become the best part of my days. When I'm working at the ranch, I'm thinking about what I'll tell you later. When I see something beautiful, a sunset or a hawk riding the wind, I want to describe it to you. I've never felt this way before. The rain was falling harder now, soaking through Sarah's thin dress, plastering Thomas's dark hair to his forehead. She knew she should speak, should say something, but the words tangled in her throat. "You don't have to say anything back," Thomas continued. "I just needed you to know. I needed you to understand that this isn't casual for me. You're not casual for me." "Thomas," Sarah finally managed, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I feel it too. I've been trying not to, trying to be practical and sensible. But when you're not here, the world feels dimmer. When you arrive, everything brightens. I look forward to these afternoons more than I've looked forward to anything in years." Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently tucked a wet strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, warm despite the rain. "Can I court you properly?" he asked. "I don't have much, but I'm a hard worker and I save my wages. I know the ranch owner, Mr. Patterson. He's a fair man. I could ask about building something more permanent, about staying instead of drifting." Sarah's heart felt too big for her chest. "You'd stay. You'd give up wandering." "I've been wandering because I was looking for something," Thomas said. "I think I've found it." The rain poured down around them, turning the dust to mud, and Sarah stepped closer. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you can court me. Yes to all of it." Thomas's smile was incandescent. He took both her hands in his, proper and respectful even in his joy. They stood there under the oak tree in the rain, water streaming down their faces. And Sarah thought no poem had ever captured this feeling, this perfect moment of possibility and promise. Finally, they ran for shelter, laughing like children, taking refuge in the covered doorway of the now closed general store. Thomas stood close, blocking the wind-driven rain with his body, and Sarah shivered, though whether from cold or proximity she couldn't say. "I should get you somewhere warm," Thomas said, ever practical. "You'll catch your death." They hurried through the muddy streets to the boarding house where Sarah took her evening meals. Mrs. Henderson, the proprietor, took one look at them and bustled Sarah inside, clucking about foolish young people and autumn storms. Thomas tipped his hat, promised to call on Sarah the next day, and headed back into the rain toward his horse. Sarah changed into dry clothes in her tiny room, her fingers trembling as she worked the buttons. Everything had changed. Thomas wanted to court her. Thomas was thinking about staying, about building something permanent. For the first time since her father's death, the future looked like something more than simple survival. Mrs. Henderson cornered her at dinner, her eyes bright with curiosity. "That's the cowboy from the double bar, isn't it? The one who stopped the fight last week?" "Yes, madam, Thomas Oakes." "He seems a steady sort," Mrs. Henderson said approvingly. "Better than some of the rough characters around here. You could do worse, dear." Sarah knew the older woman meant well, but the practical assessment of Thomas felt wrong somehow. He wasn't just a steady option or a solution to her precarious situation. He was kind and thoughtful and made her laugh. He listened when she spoke and actually cared about her thoughts. He wanted to hear her read poetry. That night, despite the continuing storm and the noise from below, Sarah slept better than she had in months. The courtship that followed became the talk of Breckenridge's small community. Thomas called on Sarah properly, arriving at her door on Sunday afternoons dressed in his cleanest clothes, his hat in hand. They would walk together through town, always in full public view as propriety demanded, and talk for hours. When weather permitted, they still met at the oak tree, though now Thomas sat closer, and sometimes their fingers would intertwine as Sarah read. Thomas proved to be a man of his word. He approached Mr. Patterson about permanent work, about building a future with the double bar rather than moving on come spring. Patterson, who valued good workers, agreed readily and even offered Thomas a small cabin on ranch property that needed repair but would be his to use. "It's not much," Thomas told Sarah as they stood on the hill overlooking the ranch, the cabin visible in the distance. "But I could fix it up, make it solid and warm, maybe add on a room or two in time." Sarah heard what he wasn't quite saying, the future he was imagining. "It looks perfect," she said softly. November came with bitter winds and early snow. Sarah's reading sessions under the oak tree became impossible, but Thomas found other ways to spend time with her. He would appear at the general store just before closing, offering to walk her safely to the boarding house. On Sundays, they attended church services together, and afterward joined other townspeople for community meals where Mrs. Kimball and Mrs. Henderson watched them with knowing smiles. Thomas was working on the cabin every spare moment, often by lamplight after long days with the cattle. Sarah itched to see it, to help, but propriety forbade an unmarried woman from visiting a man's home alone. Still, Thomas would describe the progress, his eyes lighting up as he talked about replacing rotted boards, repairing the roof, building shelves where Sarah could keep her books. "You're thinking of me when you build the shelves," Sarah said one evening as they sat in the boarding house parlor, carefully chaperoned by Mrs. Henderson, who sat knitting in the corner. "I'm thinking of you in every nail I drive, every board I place," Thomas said quietly. "I'm building it for you, Sarah, for us, if you'll have me." "Thomas," Sarah breathed, acutely aware of Mrs. Henderson's presence even though the woman was pretending not to listen. "I know I should wait," Thomas continued. "Court you longer, do things proper and slow. But Sarah, I knew the first day under that oak tree that you were someone special. I knew within a week that I was falling in love with you. And now, 2 months later, I'm so deep in love I can't imagine a single day without you in it." Mrs. Henderson's knitting needles had gone still, though she kept her eyes on her work. "I don't have a fancy ring yet," Thomas said, "but I'm saving for one. What I do have is a cabin that's almost ready, a steady job, and a heart that's entirely yours if you want it. Sarah Owens, will you marry me?" Sarah's vision blurred with tears. Every practical bone in her body screamed that this was too fast, too uncertain. But her heart, the part of her that had come alive these past months, knew the truth. She loved him. She loved his kindness and his strength, his appreciation for poetry and his honest work ethic, the way he looked at her like she was precious, and the way he made her feel safe and cherished. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Thomas, I'll marry you." Thomas reached across the proper distance between them and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. Mrs. Henderson abandoned all pretense of knitting and beamed at them. "Oh, how wonderful!" the older woman exclaimed. "Mr. Henderson will be so pleased. We should have the ceremony here at the boarding house. Christmas is coming. What a perfect time for a wedding." Everything moved quickly after that. Thomas finished work on the cabin with renewed vigor, and several men from the ranch came to help, speeding the process. Sarah spent her evenings with Mrs. Henderson and the other boarding house ladies, sewing a dress from cream-colored fabric that Mrs. Kimball sold to her at cost. Word spread through Breckenridge, and the small community rallied around them in the way frontier towns did, everyone contributing something to help the young couple start their life. Mr. Patterson gave Thomas a bonus and 2 days off for a honeymoon. Mrs. Henderson planned a wedding breakfast. The owner of the saloon, who had a surprising sentimental streak, offered to pay for a photographer to come from Denver to capture the occasion. In quieter moments, Thomas and Sarah would slip away to their oak tree, now bare of leaves and dusted with snow, and talk about their future. "Are you scared?" Thomas asked one afternoon, his arm around her shoulders as they stood looking at the dormant tree. "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "I've been on my own, making my own decisions for months now. Joining my life with yours, depending on another person, trusting in this, it's frightening." "I'm scared too," Thomas confessed. "I keep thinking about my father, how he couldn't survive without my mother. I'm scared of loving you so much that I couldn't bear to lose you." Sarah turned to face him. "Then we'll be scared together, and we'll be brave together too. We'll build a life where we're both strong, where we support each other. We'll be partners, Thomas, not just husband and wife, equal partners." Thomas kissed her forehead gently, mindful even now of propriety. "Equal partners," he agreed. "I like that." The wedding took place on December 23, 1883, in the boarding house parlor decorated with pine boughs and red ribbon. Sarah wore her cream dress with her mother's locket at her throat, her only piece of jewelry. Thomas stood at the makeshift altar in a borrowed suit, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face as she walked toward him. The circuit preacher, who happened to be passing through Breckenridge on his rounds, performed the ceremony. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Sarah softly, reverently, as if she were something infinitely precious. The small gathering of townspeople erupted in applause and cheers. The wedding breakfast Mrs. Henderson had prepared was simple but hearty: beef roast and potatoes, fresh bread, and a cake she'd somehow managed despite sugar being scarce and expensive. Someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing in the parlor, Thomas sweeping Sarah around the small space as she laughed breathlessly. As the winter sun began to set, Thomas helped Sarah into the wagon he'd borrowed, their few possessions loaded in back. Her trunk of books, his bedroll and saddle, wedding gifts of quilts and dishes and a good iron skillet. Everything they owned in the world, the foundation of their new life. The ride to the cabin took an hour through snow-dusted landscape, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Thomas kept one arm around Sarah, keeping her warm, and she leaned into his solid presence. The cabin looked like something from a fairy tale when they arrived, lamplight glowing golden in the windows. Thomas had come out earlier to light the stove and lamps, and now he lifted Sarah from the wagon and carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the tradition. Inside, the cabin was small but warm and beautifully made. Thomas had put up walls of fresh-cut wood that still smelled like pine. There was a main room with the stove, a table and chairs, and the promised bookshelves already holding her precious volumes. A curtain partitioned off a bedroom area with a sturdy bed frame that Thomas had built himself, topped with the gifted quilts. "Thomas, it's wonderful," Sarah said, turning in a slow circle. "You built this for us." "I built it for you," he corrected. "Everything, every piece of it, I was thinking of you, imagining you here, making it a home." Sarah crossed to the bookshelves, running her fingers over the spines of her books. Thomas had arranged them carefully, organizing them in a way that showed he'd paid attention to which ones were her favorites. "I'll read to you whenever you want," she said, turning back to him. "Forever, if you'd like." Thomas closed the distance between them. "Forever sounds about right," he said softly, and kissed her. Their wedding night was gentle and sweet, two people learning each other with care and patience. Thomas was tender, always checking that Sarah was comfortable, that she was happy. And Sarah, who had been alone and afraid for so long, finally felt the deep safety of being truly loved. The first months of marriage were an adjustment as they learned to share space and make decisions together. Thomas would wake before dawn to work at the ranch, coming home tired and hungry as the sun set. Sarah kept the cabin warm and clean, cooked their meals, and spent her mornings still working at the general store, though now she saved her wages for their shared future rather than bare survival. They settled into rhythms and routines. Thomas would wash up after work while Sarah finished preparing dinner, then they'd eat together, talking about their days. Afterward, Sarah would read aloud while Thomas worked on small repairs or carved pieces of wood into useful items. A new spoon, a bowl, a frame for the small mirror Sarah had received as a wedding gift. Winter deepened, and the snow piled high, isolating the ranch somewhat from town. There were days when travel was impossible, when Thomas had to stay at the ranch bunkhouse rather than risk the journey home. Sarah learned to manage the loneliness, to keep herself occupied, but she always breathed easier when she heard his boots on the porch, announcing his return. On Sundays, when weather allowed, they would bundle up and walk to their oak tree, standing beneath its bare branches like a weekly pilgrimage. Sarah would tell Thomas what she'd read that week, and he would tell her about the cattle, the horses, the vast snowy landscape. It became their tradition, their touchstone. "You miss wandering?" Sarah asked one Sunday in late January as they stood hand in hand beneath the oak. Thomas considered the question seriously, as he did everything. "Sometimes I miss the freedom of it, the possibility of each new place. But I don't miss the loneliness, and I don't miss having no real home. This is worth more than all the wandering in the world." February brought a brutal cold snap that killed livestock and kept everyone huddled indoors. Thomas came home one evening with news that made Sarah's heart sink. "Patterson is selling off part of the herd. The cattle market's been bad this year. He's keeping me on, but he had to let go 3 other hands. Said the only reason I'm staying is because I work harder than any 2 men and he needs someone reliable." "That's good though, isn't it?" Sarah said, trying to find the positive. "You still have work. For now. But Sarah, we need to be careful with money. I don't know how secure any of this is." They tightened their belts, spent even more carefully. Sarah took on extra work mending clothes for other ranch wives. Thomas took odd jobs on his days off, repairing fences for neighbors, breaking horses for the livery stable. They were careful but not afraid, facing uncertainty together. Spring arrived like a blessing, the snow melting into rushing creeks and muddy roads. The oak tree began to bud, tiny green promises of summer shade. Sarah discovered she was pregnant in late March, realized first by the nausea that struck her each morning and the tenderness in her breasts. Mrs. Henderson, who visited occasionally, confirmed her suspicions with knowing smiles. Telling Thomas was simultaneously terrifying and wonderful. They'd been married less than 4 months, were still finding their financial footing. But when Sarah spoke the words, when she told him they were going to have a baby, Thomas's face transformed with pure joy. "A baby," he repeated, as if testing the reality of it. "Sarah, we're going to have a baby." He swept her up carefully, spinning her once before setting her down gently, suddenly afraid of hurting her. His hands went to her still flat stomach, resting there with wonder. "I'm going to be a father," he said, and his eyes were wet. "I'm going to do it right, Sarah, not like mine, giving up when things got hard. I'm going to be there, solid and steady for you and this child and whatever family we build." "I know you will," Sarah said, covering his hands with hers. "You're already the best man I know." The pregnancy progressed through spring and into summer. Sarah's belly swelled as the oak tree leafed out fully, and they resumed their tradition of afternoon meetings when work allowed. Now Thomas was extra solicitous, insisting Sarah sit comfortably, bringing her water, expressing constant concern for her well-being. "I'm pregnant, not fragile," Sarah would protest, but she loved his attentiveness. She read to him from her books, and Thomas would lean close, sometimes pressing his ear to her belly, hoping to hear something of the baby growing inside. They talked endlessly about names, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about the world they hoped to give their child. The ranch recovered somewhat as spring cattle sales went better than expected. Patterson was pleased enough to give Thomas another raise, praising his dedication and skill. They began to feel more secure, more settled. Summer brought heat and the hard work of haying season. Thomas worked brutal hours, coming home exhausted and sun-darkened, but always with energy enough to check on Sarah, to ask about her day, to read her the letters that sometimes came from his aunt in Kansas, his only remaining family. Sarah's pregnancy made the summer heat harder to bear, but she managed. The women of the community, recognizing her condition, rallied with advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and stern instructions about resting. Mrs. Kimball gave her a beautiful cradle made by her late husband that had rocked her own children decades before. In August, on a day so hot even the shadows seemed to shimmer, Sarah felt the first pains. Thomas was at the ranch, too far away to reach quickly. Mrs. Henderson, who had come to visit, immediately took charge, sending her husband to fetch Thomas and the midwife while settling Sarah in the bedroom. Thomas arrived in record time, his horse lathered and blowing, his face pale with worry. The midwife, a capable woman named Ruth who had delivered half the babies in the county, shooed him out firmly. "You can pace on the porch like every other nervous father," she said. "This is women's work." Labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next day. Thomas wore a path in the porch boards, occasionally allowed inside to give Sarah water or hold her hand, then firmly removed again when the pains intensified. Mrs. Henderson stayed throughout, offering encouragement and cool cloths for Sarah's forehead. Finally, in the golden light of late afternoon on August 14, 1884, their son was born. His first cry was lusty and strong, and Ruth wrapped him quickly before placing him in Sarah's exhausted arms. "A boy," she announced, "healthy and strong." Thomas was allowed in then, and he approached the bed as if walking on sacred ground. He looked down at his son, at Sarah holding their baby, and tears streamed unashamedly down his face. "He's perfect," Thomas whispered. "Sarah, he's absolutely perfect." They named him Theodore James Oakes, after Thomas's father and Sarah's. Little Theodore, Teddy for short, had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and from the first moment he owned their hearts completely. The weeks after Teddy's birth were exhausting but magical. Thomas helped with everything, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with Teddy when he cried at night, giving Sarah time to rest and recover. Their small cabin filled with the sounds of infant gurgles and cries, and somehow felt more complete than ever. Sarah's body healed slowly, and she was grateful for Thomas's patience, for the way he held her carefully, and told her she was beautiful even when she felt worn and stretched and utterly changed. They were partners in this too, in the overwhelming task of keeping a tiny human alive and thriving. As autumn arrived and Teddy grew stronger, Sarah began reading aloud again, now with their son nestled in her arms or sleeping in his cradle nearby. Thomas would sit close, one hand resting on Teddy's small back, listening to Sarah's voice weave stories while the fire crackled and the wind howled outside. "I used to think happiness was something dramatic," Sarah said one evening, looking up from her book. "Something grand and all-consuming like in novels. But it's this, isn't it? These quiet moments, knowing you're loved, having your child safe and warm, hearing your husband's breathing beside you. This is happiness." "This is everything," Thomas agreed. Winter came again, their second as a married couple but their first as parents. The challenges were different now, keeping the cabin warm enough for Teddy, managing when Thomas couldn't get home due to snow, dealing with the exhaustion of infant care. But they faced it together, always together. In spring, when Teddy was nearly 9 months old and beginning to pull himself up on furniture, Thomas came home with news. "Patterson is expanding," he said, his excitement barely contained. "The ranch is doing well enough he's buying more land. He's offering me a position as foreman, Sarah. It means more money, more responsibility, more security." "Thomas, that's wonderful," Sarah exclaimed, carefully setting Teddy on the floor where he immediately tried to crawl toward his father. "There's more," Thomas said, scooping up his son and tossing him gently, eliciting delighted giggles. "With the position comes better housing. There's a bigger cabin on the new land, 3 rooms with a real well and a root cellar. Patterson said we could have it, said a foreman should have a proper home for his family." They moved in May of 1885, and the new cabin felt palatial compared to their first home. There was a separate bedroom for Teddy, a larger main room, and even a small porch where Sarah could sit and read while watching Teddy play. Thomas built new bookshelves, bigger and better than before, and Sarah arranged her growing collection, books she was slowly adding to whenever they could afford it. Life settled into new patterns. Thomas's position as foreman meant different hours, more decision-making, but also better pay and respect. Sarah stopped working at the general store to focus on Teddy and managing their home. They were more comfortable financially, able to save money, to think about the future beyond just surviving. But they never forgot their oak tree. Once a week, weather permitting, they would pack a lunch and walk to the hill overlooking town, spreading a blanket beneath the tree's branches. Teddy would toddle around exploring while Sarah, Reed, and Thomas listened, exactly as they had done before but richer now for the family they'd built. "You remember the first day we met here?" Sarah asked one afternoon, watching Teddy chase a butterfly with unsteady steps. "Every detail," Thomas said. "You were reading Hamlet, looking so serious and beautiful, I almost didn't have the courage to speak to you. I'm glad you did." "So am I." Thomas pulled her close, kissing her temple. "Best decision I ever made, sitting down under this tree." That summer brought a drought that worried everyone. The creeks ran low and the grass yellowed. Patterson gathered his men and made difficult decisions about which pastures to use, how to manage water resources. Thomas worked long hours, coming home tired and worried. "We'll get through it," Sarah assured him, though she felt the anxiety too. They depended on the ranch, on Thomas's position, on Patterson's success. The drought broke in September with storms that flooded the dried creeks and brought blessed relief. The crisis passed, the ranch survived, and Thomas's careful management during the difficult months impressed Patterson enough that he gave Thomas a share in the ranch's profits, a small percentage but meaningful. "We're building something real here," Thomas told Sarah that night. "Something lasting. For us, for Teddy, for whatever other children we might have." Sarah smiled, her hand going to her belly where she suspected, though it was too early to be sure, that another child was already growing. She was right. In winter she confirmed another pregnancy, due in early summer. Teddy was nearly 2 now, walking and talking in simple sentences, a bright and happy child. The prospect of a second baby felt less frightening this time, more exciting. Thomas was predictably overjoyed. "Our family is growing," he said, picking up Teddy and spinning him around. "You're going to be a big brother." Teddy didn't understand but laughed at his father's enthusiasm. The pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Sarah knew what to expect and was stronger, more settled. She continued managing the household while preparing for another infant, sewing clothes, organizing the cabin, reading Teddy stories about being a big brother. Their daughter was born on June 2nd, 1886, on a beautiful morning when the world seemed fresh and new. The labor was faster than Teddy's, though still exhausting, and when Ruth placed the baby in Sarah's arms, she felt the same overwhelming love she'd felt with her son. "A daughter," Sarah said, looking at Thomas, who stood beside the bed. "We have a daughter." They named her Sophia Mee Oakes, and she had her mother's delicate features and her father's dark coloring. Teddy was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to touch her gently, to help with her care in his toddler way. The cabin that had seemed so spacious now felt full of life and noise and love. Thomas added on another small room, giving Teddy his own space so the baby could sleep in the second bedroom. They were expanding, growing, becoming more permanent. Sarah sometimes felt exhausted by the demands of two small children, by the endless cycle of feeding and changing and soothing and playing. But Thomas never made her feel alone in it. He would come home from long days and immediately take over with the children, giving Sarah time to simply breathe. On Sundays, they still made their pilgrimage to the oak tree, now carrying Teddy and baby Sophia, spreading their blanket and reading together as a family. "I asked you once if you'd read forever," Thomas said one afternoon, watching Sarah read to Teddy while Sophia nursed. "You're doing it, giving our children the gift of stories like my mother gave me. It's the best gift I know how to give," Sarah said. "Books saved me when I was alone. They'll show our children there's more to the world than just Breckenridge." The years that followed were full ones. Teddy grew into a bright boy who loved horses and followed his father around whenever possible. Sophia developed a quick temper and quicker smile, keeping everyone on their toes. The ranch continued to prosper under Patterson's ownership and Thomas's management. In 1888, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise as they'd thought their family might be complete. Thomas greeted the news with his usual joy, though they both felt some trepidation about managing 3 children. Their second son, Samuel Thomas Oakes, was born in January of 1889 during a snowstorm that nearly prevented the midwife from reaching them. Thomas, who had helped deliver enough calves and foals to have some idea what he was doing, was prepared to help Sarah himself if necessary. But Ruth arrived in time, snow-covered and grumbling about winter babies, and Samuel entered the world healthy and squalling. With 3 children, life became a careful choreography of managing different needs and schedules. Teddy was old enough to help with small chores, proud of his role as big brother. Sophia, at 2 years old, was both help and hindrance, wanting to do everything herself. Baby Samuel was easier than the other 2 had been, a calm baby who nursed well and slept in long stretches. Thomas's position at the ranch continued to grow. By 1890, he was essentially running the day-to-day operations, and Patterson, who was getting older, relied on him completely. There were discussions of Thomas eventually buying a share of the ranch outright, becoming a partner rather than just an employee. "Could we afford that?" Sarah asked when Thomas broached the subject. "Not yet," Thomas admitted, "but Patterson's offering terms, payments over time." "It would be an investment in our future, Sarah. Real ownership, something to pass down to our children." They discussed it seriously, weighing risks and possibilities. Finally, they agreed. In spring of 1891, Thomas signed papers making him a junior partner in the Double Bar Ranch. It was terrifying and thrilling, a huge responsibility but also a huge opportunity. The partnership meant more work, more stress, but also more control over their destiny. Thomas had a voice in all major decisions, and his share of the profits was substantial enough that they began to feel genuinely financially secure for the first time. Sarah used some of the money to order books from Denver, and even some from back east. The shelves Thomas had built began to overflow, and he built more, until one entire wall of their cabin was books. Neighbors began borrowing from their collection, and Sarah would discuss the stories with anyone interested. The oak tree remained their constant, their weekly touchstone. The children loved going there, running around the hillside while their parents sat beneath the branches. Sarah still read aloud, now to an audience of 5, her voice carrying on the wind as she shared stories of far-off places and long-ago times. In summer of 1892, tragedy struck when a fire broke out in Breckenridge, consuming several buildings including the general store where Sarah had once worked. Mrs. Kimball escaped with her life but lost her business and home. Without hesitation, Thomas and Sarah offered her a place with them until she could rebuild. "We have the room," Sarah insisted when the older woman protested. "And you were kind to me when I needed it. Please let us help, Mrs." Kimball stayed with them for 3 months, and her presence was actually a blessing. She helped with the children, giving Sarah more time to manage the household, and her cheerful disposition kept spirits high. When she finally moved into a new shop in town, rebuilt with help from the community, she hugged Sarah tightly. "You've become a remarkable woman," she said. "Your parents would be proud." Life continued its forward march. Teddy started attending the small school in town when he turned 7, riding into Breckenridge 3 days a week. Sophia would follow when she reached school age, though for now she stayed home, helping Sarah with Samuel and the household tasks. Thomas turned 32 in 1893, and they celebrated with a party at the cabin, inviting ranch families and town friends. It was a squeeze fitting everyone in, but they managed, with children running everywhere and adults laughing over food and drink. Patterson attended, now in his 60s and slowing down, and publicly toasted Thomas as the best decision he'd ever made. "This ranch succeeds because of Thomas Oakes," Patterson said, raising his glass. "His dedication, his integrity, his skill. I couldn't ask for a better partner or a better man." Sarah glowed with pride, watching her husband accept the praise with characteristic humility. This was the man who had sat down under an oak tree 10 years ago, the drifting cowboy who had chosen to stay. He'd built this life through hard work and determination, but more than that, he'd built it with love. That night, after everyone had left and the children were asleep, Thomas and Sarah sat on their porch in the cool evening air, exhausted but happy. "10 years," Thomas said, taking Sarah's hand. "Can you believe it's been nearly 10 years since I saw you reading under that tree? Best 10 years of my life," Sarah said. "Though that first year when I was alone, that was hard. I didn't think I'd survive it. But you did. You're stronger than you know, Sarah." "We're strong together," Sarah corrected. "That's what makes it work." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds, the distant cattle, the wind through the grass. This was home, Sarah thought, not the cabin or the ranch, though those mattered. Home was wherever Thomas was, wherever their children slept safely, wherever love was the foundation. The mid-1890s brought economic depression to much of the country, but the ranch weathered it better than some due to careful management and diversification. Thomas made sure they raised sheep as well as cattle, grew crops as well as hay, hedged against any one market failing. His caution and planning kept the ranch profitable when others struggled. By 1895, Teddy was nearly 11, a serious boy who loved school and reading as much as his mother. Sophia was 9, all energy and opinions, already showing skill with horses that made her father proud. Samuel was 6, the baby of the family, sweet-natured and quick to laugh. Sarah, at 34, sometimes felt the weight of the years. She was no longer the slender young woman Thomas had met under the oak tree. 3 pregnancies had changed her body, hard work had worn her hands, and her face showed lines that hadn't been there a decade before. But when Thomas looked at her, she saw only love and desire in his eyes, unchanged by time. "You're more beautiful now than the day I met you," he told her one evening. "You're a terrible liar," Sarah said, laughing. "I'm not lying." Thomas pulled her close. "The woman I met was lovely but lonely, reading by herself, uncertain about the future. The woman you are now, Sarah, the mother of my children, my partner in building this life, strong and confident and surrounded by love, you're radiant. You're everything." Sarah kissed him then, deeply, still capable of being moved by his words after all these years. In 1896, Patterson approached Thomas with a proposition. He wanted to retire fully, to go live with his daughter in California. He offered to sell Thomas his remaining share of the ranch, making Thomas the sole owner, again on terms they could manage. It was a huge decision, one that kept Sarah and Thomas up late for many nights discussing. Full ownership meant full responsibility, all the risk and all the reward. But it also meant true security, something they could build on for generations. They agreed, signing the papers in spring of 1897. The Double Bar Ranch was now Thomas Oakes's property. It was terrifying and wonderful all at once. To celebrate, Thomas did something unexpected. He took the family to Denver for a week, the children's first trip to a real city. They stayed in a hotel, ate in restaurants, visited shops and museums. Sarah felt like she'd stepped into one of her books, experiencing the wider world she'd only read about. The highlight was attending a theater performance, a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Sarah sat in the plush seat holding Thomas's hand, tears streaming down her face at the beauty of it, at the realization that she was actually here, that her life had brought her to this moment. The children were entranced, even young Samuel sitting quietly for once, caught up in the magic of live theater. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to Thomas as the curtain fell. "Thank you for this. You gave up your dreams of the East to stay in Breckenridge with me," Thomas said. "I wanted you to experience at least a taste of what you'd sacrificed." "I didn't sacrifice anything," Sarah said firmly. "I chose you, chose our life, and I'd choose it again 1,000 times." They returned to the ranch renewed, ready to face the challenges of ownership. Thomas threw himself into improving operations, building on what Patterson had started but adding his own vision. Sarah managed the household and took on bookkeeping for the ranch, her careful mathematics and attention to detail proving invaluable. The children grew and changed. Teddy, at 13, was already helping with serious ranch work, learning from his father. Sophia declared she wanted to train horses professionally, shocking some of the more traditional ranch wives, but earning Thomas's full support. Samuel showed an aptitude for mechanical things, taking apart and rebuilding anything he could get his hands on. In 1899, as the new century approached, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. At 38, she was older than ideal for pregnancy, and the news brought both joy and concern. Thomas was immediately protective, insisting she rest more, do less. "I'm pregnant, not dying," Sarah protested, though privately she felt more tired than she had with previous pregnancies. The children were excited about another sibling, though Teddy, now 14 and increasingly aware, seemed worried about his mother. Sophia wanted a sister, Samuel wanted a brother, and they argued good-naturedly about it constantly. The pregnancy was harder on Sarah's body than the others had been. She felt exhausted and uncomfortable, the summer heat oppressive. Thomas hovered worryingly, and even the children seemed more solicitous than usual. Their daughter, Lily Ann Oakes was born on October 3, 1899, just as the leaves on the oak tree were turning gold. The labor was long and difficult, and Ruth, the midwife, looked concerned more than once. But finally, just before dawn, Lily arrived, tiny and perfect and utterly beautiful. "Another daughter," Sarah breathed, exhausted but elated. "We have another daughter." Thomas held Lily carefully, this child of their middle years, and Sarah saw tears in his eyes. "She's a gift," he said, "a blessing as we head into the new century." Recovery was slow this time, and Sarah felt the weight of her years. But having older children helped tremendously. Sophia stepped up to help with the baby, showing a nurturing side she'd hidden beneath her tomboyish exterior. Teddy managed more of the household tasks, and even Samuel tried to help in his 7-year-old way. As the year 1900 arrived, there was talk everywhere of the new century, of progress and change. The railroad had reached closer to Breckenridge, bringing easier access to the wider world. Telegraph lines meant faster communication. The Wild West of Sarah's youth was slowly being tamed, becoming something more settled and civilized, but some things remained constant. The oak tree still stood on its hill overlooking town. The ranch still required hard work and dedication. And every Sunday, when weather allowed, the Oakes family made their pilgrimage to sit beneath the tree's branches while Sarah read aloud to her family. Now it was a production to get them all there, with Lily nursing and Samuel's boundless energy and Sophia's teenager moods. But they did it faithfully, because it mattered, because it connected them to their beginning. "Tell us again how you met," Sophia demanded one Sunday afternoon, a request the children made regularly. Sarah looked at Thomas, seeing him as he was now at 39, still strong but with silver threading through his dark hair, lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. He was even more handsome to her now than he'd been at 28, marked by a life well lived. "Your father sat down one day while I was reading," Sarah began the familiar story. "He asked what I was reading and we started talking." "And you fell in love right away?" Lily asked, even at 3 months, obviously her father's daughter. "Not right away," Thomas corrected gently, "but quickly." "Very quickly. I knew within days that your mother was someone special, and by the time I asked her to marry me, I couldn't imagine my life without her." "Tell us about the wedding," Samuel prompted. They told the stories their children loved about the wedding in the boarding house, the first cabin Thomas built, the early struggles and small triumphs. Teddy had heard it all before but listened anyway, old enough now to understand the weight of what his parents had built. As the first decade of the new century unfolded, life continued to change and evolve. Teddy, at 18, was essentially running the ranch alongside his father, already talking about his own future, his own plans. Sophia, at 16, had indeed become a skilled horse trainer, earning respect even from men twice her age. Samuel showed signs of becoming an engineer, his mechanical mind always working on solutions and improvements. And Lily, their surprise youngest, was a bright and loving child who adored her older siblings and had both parents wrapped around her tiny finger. Sarah, now in her early 40s, felt the pace of life slowing somewhat. Her body ached more, she tired more easily, but she was content in a way she'd never imagined possible in those desperate months after her father's death. She had built a life, raised children, supported her husband, and somehow found time to read and dream and share those dreams with her family. In 1905, Teddy married a neighbor's daughter, a sweet girl named Anna who loved him dearly. The wedding was held at the ranch, under a tent in the yard, and the entire community came to celebrate. Sarah watched her firstborn speak his vows and felt the bittersweet ache of seeing her child become a man. Thomas held her hand throughout the ceremony, understanding her emotions without words. Their own wedding, over 20 years ago now, seemed both impossibly distant and like yesterday. How could so much time have passed? How could they have built so much, loved so much, lived so much? That night, dancing with Thomas at the reception, Sarah said, "We're getting old." "We're getting older," Thomas corrected. "But we're doing it together just like we promised." "Equal partners," Sarah said, remembering. "Always," Thomas agreed. As they moved into their late 40s and their children became adults, Sarah and Thomas found themselves alone more often, the cabin quiet in ways it hadn't been in over 20 years. Teddy had built a home on the ranch property for his growing family. Sophia left for a season to work at a prestigious horse training facility in Wyoming, though she promised to return. Samuel had gone to Denver to study engineering, his letters home full of excitement about his classes and his future. Only Lily remained, and at 6 years old she would soon start school, beginning her own journey toward independence. Sarah felt the emptiness sometimes, the loss of the constant noise and chaos of a house full of children. But she also rediscovered the quiet pleasure of time alone with Thomas, of conversations without interruption, of being simply a couple again rather than primarily parents. They still went to the oak tree, though less frequently now. But when they did, it felt like coming home to themselves, to the people they'd been before children and responsibilities and the weight of years. "You have regrets?" Thomas asked one afternoon as they sat beneath the tree. No children to watch, no book to read, just the two of them and the wind and the wide Colorado sky. "Not a single one," Sarah said truthfully. "Not even the hard parts, the struggles, the fears. It all led here to this life to you." "I asked you once if you'd read forever," Thomas said, pulling her close. "You said yes, and I meant it." "I'd like to amend the request," Thomas said. "I'd like you to just stay forever. Reading or not reading doesn't matter, just stay, Sarah. Keep being here with me, building this life, loving me as much as I love you." Sarah turned to face him fully, seeing every line on his face, every gray hair, every mark of their shared years. "Forever," she agreed. "I'll stay forever." In 1908, when Sarah was 47 and Thomas was 47, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. The children organized a party at the ranch, now a thriving operation that employed dozens of people and shipped cattle and horses throughout the region. Teddy and Anna had given them 2 grandchildren, with another on the way. Sophia had returned from Wyoming and was establishing her own horse training business on ranch land. Samuel was working for a Denver engineering firm but came home regularly. And Lily, now 9 years old, was growing into a thoughtful, book-loving girl who reminded Sarah powerfully of herself. At the party, surrounded by family and friends, by the community they'd become part of and the life they'd built, Thomas stood to speak. 25 years ago, I was a drifting cowboy with no home and no purpose," he began. "I rode into Breckenridge looking for work, and I found everything instead. I found Sarah reading under an oak tree, and somehow I found the courage to sit down and talk to her. That conversation changed my life. That woman changed my life." He looked at Sarah, his eyes bright with emotion. "You've given me everything, Sarah. A home, a family, a reason to build rather than drift. You've made me a better man than I ever thought I could be. And every single day for 25 years, I've woken up grateful that you said yes when I asked you to marry me." Sarah was crying openly now, as were half the women present. Thomas raised his glass. "To my wife, Sarah, to 25 years and to all the years ahead, to forever." "To forever," the crowd echoed, drinking the toast. Later, when the party had wound down and they were alone in their cabin, Thomas gave Sarah a gift. It was a new book, a first edition of a novel she'd mentioned wanting but thinking it too expensive. "Thomas, this must have cost a fortune," she protested. "You're worth a fortune," he said simply. "You're worth everything." Sarah opened the book carefully, admiring the crisp pages, breathing in the smell of new paper and ink. Then she smiled and began to read aloud, her voice still clear and strong after all these years. Thomas settled beside her, listening as he had for 25 years, as he would for all the years to come. The second quarter-century of their marriage passed more quickly than the first, or perhaps it simply felt that way. Time has a way of accelerating as we age, each year seeming shorter than the last. Sarah and Thomas moved into their 50s, and then their 60s, their hair going completely gray, their bodies slowing but their minds and hearts remaining sharp. The ranch continued to prosper under their management, though they gradually turned over more responsibility to Teddy and his growing family. Sophia married in 1912, a quiet man who worked as a veterinarian and supported her horse training career completely. They had 3 children and remained on the ranch, building their own small empire within the larger operation. Samuel married his college sweetheart and settled in Denver, visiting regularly and always bringing new books for his mother. Lily, the baby, married at 22 to a teacher from Breckenridge, and they took over the town's small school, modernizing it and improving education for the next generation. Sarah became a grandmother many times over, her cabin filling regularly with children and grandchildren who demanded stories and cookies and the attention of their beloved grandmother. She read to each of them just as she'd read to her own children, passing on the love of stories and books. Thomas remained strong into his late 60s, still riding out to check cattle, still making decisions about the ranch, though he'd officially retired and made Teddy the primary owner. He loved his grandchildren fiercely and could often be found teaching them to ride or showing them how to care for horses or simply holding them while they slept. In 1915, Sarah was diagnosed with arthritis in her hands, making it painful to hold books for extended periods. Thomas built her a special book stand so she could read without gripping the pages, and on days when her hands hurt too much, he would read aloud to her instead, his rough cowboy voice stumbling over the words but filled with love. They still visited the oak tree when they could, though the walk was harder now. Sometimes Teddy would drive them in the wagon, helping them settle beneath the branches of the tree that had witnessed the beginning of their love story. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1923, Sarah was 62 and Thomas was 62. They had a small celebration, just immediate family, as big parties exhausted them now. But the love in the room was palpable, the evidence of a life well lived surrounding them in the form of children and grandchildren. That evening, Thomas and Sarah sat on their porch, holding hands and watching the sunset paint the Colorado sky in shades of gold and pink. 40 years, Sarah said softly. How did we get so lucky? I don't think it was luck, Thomas replied. I think it was choice. Every day we chose each other. We chose to stay, to work, to love even when it was hard. It was hard sometimes, Sarah acknowledged. But never for a moment did I regret it. Neither did I, Thomas said. I love you, Sarah. I love you exactly as much as I did that first day under the tree, and somehow even more because of all the years between. They sat in peaceful silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon. 2 people who had built a life from nothing but love and determination, who had raised children and weathered storms, and created something beautiful and lasting. In the years that followed, they continued to slow down but never to stop. Thomas still walked out to look at cattle, though now he took a cane. Sarah still read voraciously, though she needed glasses and good light. They still loved each other with the fierce devotion of people who had chosen each other every day for decades. In 1928, as they approached their 45th anniversary, Sarah fell ill with pneumonia. It was serious, scary, but she fought through it with her characteristic determination. Thomas barely left her bedside, holding her hand, reading to her when she was too weak to read herself, praying to a God he'd rarely addressed that he would let her stay just a little longer. Sarah recovered, though she was weakened. The illness had taken something from her, left her more fragile. But her spirit remained strong, and on good days she was still herself, still sharp and loving and fully present. On their 45th anniversary, December 23, 1928, they had a quiet dinner at home with just Thomas and Sarah. He'd hired someone to cook so Sarah wouldn't tire herself, and they ate by candlelight like they were young again. "You remember our wedding night?" Thomas asked, his eyes twinkling. "Thomas Oakes, you're 77 years old," Sarah said, laughing. "Too old to be thinking such thoughts." "I'll never be too old to think those thoughts about you," Thomas countered, making her blush like a girl. After dinner, Sarah asked Thomas to take her to the oak tree. It was cold. December in Colorado was always brutal, but she insisted. They bundled in coats and scarves, and Teddy drove them in his motor car, a modern convenience Thomas still didn't entirely trust. The tree stood bare against the winter sky, its branches dark and twisted with age. Thomas helped Sarah from the car, and they stood together beneath the tree where it had all begun 45 years earlier. "This is where I first saw you," Thomas said. "Right here, reading your book, looking so serious and beautiful." "This is where you asked if you could sit down," Sarah remembered. "Where you asked me to read forever. And you did. You've read to me for 45 years, Sarah. You've given me forever." Sarah leaned against Thomas, feeling his solid strength even at 77, and looked up at the bare branches against the darkening sky. "I'd do it again," she said. "All of it, exactly the same. Every moment led us here, and here is exactly where I want to be." They stood there in the cold until Teddy called that it was time to go home, that it was too cold for them to be out. But before they left, Thomas pulled Sarah close and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of decades of love. "Forever," he whispered against her lips. "Forever," she agreed. Sarah's health declined slowly over the next year. She had good days and bad days, days when she seemed herself and days when the effort of living seemed too much. Thomas never left her side when she needed him, caring for her with the same tender devotion he'd shown for 46 years. In October of 1929, as the country reeled from economic collapse, as the world seemed to be falling apart, Sarah's health took a turn for the worse. She was confined to bed, too weak to get up, and the doctor's face was grave. Thomas moved a chair beside the bed and sat there, holding her hand. Their children came, one by one, to say what they needed to say. Grandchildren visited, confused by their grandmother's weakness but understanding somehow that this was important, that they needed to remember. On a quiet October afternoon, with Thomas holding her hand and autumn sunlight streaming through the window, Sarah looked at her husband of nearly 46 years. "Read to me," she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas picked up the book on the bedside table, one of her favorites, worn from countless readings. But before he could begin, Sarah stopped him. "No, tell me our story instead. Tell me about the oak tree, about the cowboy who sat down, about the girl who read books." So Thomas did. He told her about seeing her for the first time, about gathering his courage to speak to her, about falling in love more quickly than he'd thought possible. He told her about their courtship and wedding, about building their first cabin, about each of their children's births. He told her about the struggles and triumphs, the hard times and good times, the life they'd built together from nothing but love and determination. Sarah listened with her eyes closed, a soft smile on her face, holding Thomas's hand as tightly as her weakening grip allowed. "It was a good life," she whispered when he finished. "The best life." "The best life," Thomas agreed, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for every moment of it." Sarah opened her eyes one last time, looking at the man she'd loved for 46 years, the cowboy who had sat down under an oak tree and changed everything. "Forever," she whispered. "Forever," Thomas promised. Sarah Owens Oakes passed away peacefully on October 15, 1929, at the age of 68, surrounded by the family she'd built and holding the hand of the man she'd loved. The funeral was held at the small church in Breckenridge, but afterward, at Sarah's request expressed in the final days, Thomas and their children took her ashes to the oak tree. There, beneath the branches where it had all begun, they scattered Sarah's ashes, returning her to the place that had witnessed the start of their love story. Thomas stood beneath the tree long after everyone else had left, one hand resting on the rough bark, feeling closer to Sarah here than anywhere else in the world. For the next few months, Thomas seemed to simply go through the motions of living. He'd lost weight, lost interest in the ranch, lost the spark that had always defined him. The children worried, remembering his story about his own father giving up after losing his wife. But Thomas had made a promise to Sarah years ago that he wouldn't give up, that he would be strong. And he had a reason to keep living that his father hadn't had. He had children and grandchildren who needed him, who loved him, who wanted him to stay. Slowly, painfully, Thomas found his way back to life. Not the same life, never the same without Sarah, but a life nonetheless. He spent time with his grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandmother. He helped Teddy with the ranch, his experience and knowledge still valuable. He visited the oak tree every Sunday, sitting beneath it and talking to Sarah as if she were still there. In his small cabin, now far too quiet, Thomas would read aloud from Sarah's books, imagining she was listening. It comforted him, this continuation of their tradition, this way of keeping her present. The Depression ravaged the country, but the ranch survived through careful management and the foundation Thomas and Sarah had built. The family stayed together, supporting each other through the hard times, exemplifying the values their parents had instilled. Thomas Oakes lived for 5 more years after Sarah's death. He saw grandchildren marry and great-grandchildren born. He saw his children grow into strong, capable adults who carried forward the legacy of love and hard work he and Sarah had established. He saw the ranch weather economic storms and emerge stronger. On December 23, 1934, what would have been his 51st wedding anniversary, Thomas asked Teddy to take him to the oak tree. It was cold, snowing lightly, but Thomas insisted. They drove out together, and Teddy helped his father from the car. Thomas stood beneath the tree, one hand on its trunk, and looked out over the landscape he'd called home for over 50 years. He thought of Sarah, of the life they'd built, of the love that had sustained him through everything. "I'm ready," he said quietly to the tree, to Sarah, to whatever came next. "I've kept my promise. I stayed strong, I took care of our family, I made sure our legacy would continue. But I'm ready now, Sarah. I'm ready to come home to you." Teddy drove his father back to the cabin, worried by his words but understanding them too. That night, Thomas Oakes died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, a slight smile on his face as if he'd seen something beautiful in his final moments. The family buried Thomas beside the oak tree, his ashes mingling with Sarah's in the spot where their love story had begun. A simple stone marked the place, reading only, Thomas and Sarah Oakes forever. The oak tree stood for many more years, becoming a landmark, a place where couples would come to pledge their love, where families would picnic, where the story of Thomas and Sarah Oakes became part of local legend. The tree that had witnessed the beginning of a great love story became a symbol of enduring love, of the power of choosing each other, of building a life from nothing but determination and devotion. The ranch continued, passed down through generations of Oakes family, each adding their own chapter to the story, but always remembering the foundation that Thomas and Sarah had laid. The cabin where they'd raised their family was preserved, Sarah's books still on the shelves Thomas had built, a small museum to a love that had changed everything. And every December 23rd, the anniversary of Thomas and Sarah's wedding, the family would gather at the oak tree. Someone would read aloud from one of Sarah's books, sharing her love of stories with new generations. They would tell the story of how Thomas had sat down one day and asked Sarah to read forever, and how that simple request had begun something beautiful and lasting. The legacy of Thomas and Sarah Oakes wasn't measured in land or cattle or money, though they'd been successful enough. Their real legacy was in the family they'd built, in the values they'd instilled, in the proof that love could be the foundation of everything worthwhile. They'd shown their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren that choosing each other every day, working together through struggles, supporting each other's dreams, and never giving up on each other could create something miraculous. Their story lived on, told and retold, inspiring others to believe in the power of love, the importance of choosing wisely and loving fiercely, the value of building rather than drifting. Two people who had found each other under an oak tree in Breckenridge, Colorado in 1883, had created something that echoed through generations, proving that the best love stories aren't the dramatic or perfect ones, but the real ones built day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment, until a lifetime of moments becomes forever.